I'd like to welcome everyone in the room and those who are following on the live webcast to this morning's panel, Restoring Dignity, the Case of the Rohingya. If you're live tweeting the session, please remember the hashtag GPF18. I'm thrilled to welcome to the stage my fellow panelists, all very distinguished and all with a tremendous experience from the ground of the current situation of the Rohingya. Please welcome them to the stage, and I'll introduce them all. To my immediate right is Mohammed Musa. He's the Executive Director of BRAC. BRAC is a major international development and humanitarian organization based in Bangladesh, in fact one of the biggest in the world. And Mohammed, you have enormous experience internationally. In the middle, Airleen File is from the Board of Directors of MSF. She is a midwife and an expert on sexual and gender-based violence. And to my right, I'm delighted to recommend Nirmala Rao, who is the Vice Chancellor of the Asian University for Women. She has a very, very distinguished academic career internationally, and we'll talk about the work that she's doing around the role of education. I'm Ian Levine from Human Rights Watch and the Deputy Executive Director for Programme, where I'm responsible for our research and reporting globally around the world. We're living in very difficult times for human rights. That's not something I really need to say to anybody in this room. We're living at a time of enormous challenges of human rights norms and humanitarian norms, the very norms that protect human dignity around the world. And increasingly, in an age of growing xenophobia and growing nationalism, we're not only seeing a pushback against international norms and standards, norms of human rights protection and humanitarian protection, we're seeing attacks against the very institutions that seek to protect international norms, international values, and the dignity of all, including refugees, migrants, asylum seekers, and other minorities. Growing nationalism in Europe, in Asia, and of course here in North America has created growing cynicism about the role being played by international institutions, the UN itself, its ability to protect civilians in Syria, in Yemen, Afghanistan, and so many other places. My kids are not the only ones who are asking what is actually being done to protect civilians. A recent New York Times op-ed was titled, "How the Human Rights Movement Failed." It was a very bad title, and it wasn't true, but it was symptomatic, I think, of so many of the challenges that we are increasingly facing to norms that we had long believed were established as the basis of our common humanity. In that context, helping and supporting the Rohingya to restore their dignity is a huge challenge for the international system, for the human rights and humanitarian communities, and for all those who support them. As most of you will know, the Rohingya have been for generations a marginalized and stateless minority living mostly in Myanmar. And with the transition in recent times from the military dictatorship and with Aung San Suu Kyi, a figure revered internationally, becoming a powerful political figure in Myanmar, there was real hope that things would change. There were enormous hopes and expectations, not just for democracy more broadly, but particularly for the situation of the Rohingya. Those hopes and expectations have been brutally unfulfilled and dashed. On August the 25th last year, there was a military skirmish between the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army and Burmese Myanmar military forces, which unleashed a massive military operation against the Rohingya in Rakhine State in Myanmar. Scores of villages were burnt and subsequently bulldozed. Untold numbers of people were killed, women raped, and forced to flee. And the outpouring of civilians into neighboring Bangladesh was the fastest outpouring of civilians that the world has witnessed since the 1994 Rwanda genocide. In the space of weeks following August the 25th last year, almost 700,000 Rohingya fled to Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh to live in extremely difficult situations in refugee camps there. And we'll talk in a few minutes with the fellow panelists about the situations on the camp. Human Rights Watch, amongst many other groups, documented the atrocities, both through satellite imagery to show the extent of the destruction of villages, as well as through on-the-ground reporting. I talked to several of our colleagues who went there, very, very experienced colleagues who've documented atrocities in many parts of the world, and all of them said it was one of the most difficult reporting experiences they'd ever had. One colleague who reported on the sexual and gender-based violence said to me, the worst thing was that the women all said to me that being raped wasn't even the worst thing that happened to them. As we think about rights and we think about dignity and we think about hope, just a couple of things I want to say before I hand over to my panelists. It's easy to criticize the UN for its failure to protect the Rohingya, both inside Myanmar and beyond, but there is engagement that we can build on. The UN Security Council just in the last few days visited Cox's Bazar, the refugee camps there, as well as Myanmar. One of the Security Council ambassadors was quoted in the press as saying, "The number of heavily traumatized men, women, and children that we met was beyond comprehension." The UN Secretary General added the Myanmar military to the UN list of shame of armies that commit sexual violence against civilians. And the UN system has appointed a fact-finding mission to document the atrocities committed against the Rohingya, although to date it has no access. When it comes to justice and accountability, the situation is very bleak. There's been almost complete impunity. There is no proper government investigation of the crimes of its own military. And clearly the situation needs the referral to the International Criminal Court for a proper international investigation to take place. And the last thing to mention is repatriation. There is obviously much talk, and the panelists will talk more about that, much more, about how the Rohingya can return to Myanmar from Bangladesh. There are almost 900,000 of them there now, counting those who had fled in previous times. At the moment, it's impossible to envisage any kind of safe, dignified, or sustainable return for the Rohingya. There's no access for human rights monitors or independent humanitarian action in Rakhine State from which they have fled. There's no security. There's no livelihood. There's no citizenship. And because there has been no justice, there's absolutely zero sense of security. There is also growing repression of freedom of speech in Myanmar, and in fact, 2 Reuters journalists are currently facing 14 years in jail simply for doing their job of reporting about crimes committed by the military against the Rohingya. So in that context, I'm thrilled to turn to my panelists. I'm going to start with Mohammed Musa from BRAC. Tell us something about your work there and the challenges and opportunities that you're seeing with your work with the Rohingya in Bangladesh.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Let me make 3 points as opening remarks of this panel discussion, and then maybe I can elaborate some of those later. First point I would like to make is based on my experience of standing on the side of the bank of the river Naf, which kind of is the river between Myanmar and southeastern part of Bangladesh. I was standing there as the flood of people are coming in as refugees. And I was looking at them and clearly kind of feeling like that these refugees are different than the refugee life that I led when I was 12 years old and we had a liberation war in Bangladesh. And I had to walk for 17 days without food and without water with my parents' family. And then we were in the tent for next 6 months. That life of refugees are different than the refugees I saw when they came from Rohingya. The basic difference is that these Rohingya people that came, that not only saw the killing in front of their eyes, rape in front of their eyes, they not only saw their own houses are being burned, their children are thrown, and they came being thirsty, hungry, pain. But more importantly, I saw in their eyes There's no hope. I saw in their face that a sign of loss of dignity. As I began to speak with some of them as they were arriving and kind of simply sitting down in the mud under the rain, many of them are saying, we basically do not belong to this world. I witnessed on those days, standing there with my colleagues and many PR agency colleagues, that the clear sign of loss of human rights for which we stand. I saw the total destruction of humanity. And I felt this is different. Different because these people lost their hope. They don't feel same as I feel. They don't feel that they belong to this which is completely different. Number second point I want to mention, that in our response from BRAC, but also our other PR organizations that we began to respond, like we have MSF, we had CARE, Save the Children, many other organizations, and individuals, all of us were responding. A key component we had to add into the design as well as implementation of those humanitarian intervention was not just the goods and services that we are offering. It was not just the food, shelter, healthcare, protection, and various other measures that we are taking. It was more important to stand beside those people. Give those people, 60% of whom are women and girls, the hope. Hope that now this world needs them. This world care for them. Give them the belief that, no, we are with you. It was extremely important, therefore, to build into that each of the interventions the component of dignity. How did you do it? Like 1,600 people of BRAC, 400 were BRAC's employee, for example, and remaining we hired from local communities and Rohingya refugees themselves over time. They not only were kind of standing beside those people, walking with them to the place where they were to go, as they were moving from the initial crisis to the intermediate makeshift settlement to relatively longer-term settlements. Give them the feeling that we care as human beings. You design interventions in a way where you deliver it for women, men, girls, boys, to make sure they have equal rights but different needs that are met. Third point I would mention is that while with the last 7-8 months' time, the situation is apparently settled down now, our challenge is there in front of us. Some of the challenges are immediate, some are mid-term, some are longer-term. Immediate challenges include the monsoon season that is coming in. The areas where these refugees settle down, that's an area where heavy monsoon takes place, and those are hilly areas, so landslide is quite common. And as landslide happen, every year people die. This time the tents are located in very dangerous areas, but you cannot simply move them. It's not a logistical issue. If you want to move them, it's a very complex social issue. People wouldn't like to move their tent from one location to another for multiple reasons, which I can elaborate later. So they're vulnerable to another crisis, which is kind of coming up. Yet, we have challenges of dealing with that. Along with that, monsoon are likely to come disease outbreaks and various other problems. In the intermediate part, the challenges include issues like we have about 48,000 pregnant women now. Many of them are pregnant because of the rape that happened. And it's not just the maternal and child health care that need to be provided to many of them who otherwise wouldn't have access to it. It's also the stigma that these women and the children who would be born would likely to get because they're the victim of rape. How do we deal with them? Associated with that, this tension between a host community, which is growing, and the refugees because of the gradually scarce common property resources like water, forest resources, and various other things is increasing. So how do we really deal with that? And the longer-term challenge, as my friend mentioned, that what is that repatriation issue? Are we really able to work with the government of Myanmar together to help them create a condition which allow these refugees to go back voluntarily, feeling safe, feeling dignified, and would feel that this movement would be sustainable, where they would have the economic and other well-being. To do that, it's not just UN. We all need to really work together to maybe enable women, equip women with studies, with data, as we are doing, like from BRAC, we undertook 2 studies in the last couple of months to get the voices of the Rohingya people into the advocacy messages, so that UN and various other agencies who are talking with decision makers can be equipped to make changes in the right, help make decisions that will be right. I would be happy to elaborate some of those points later, but these are some of my immediate opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Ellen, both Mohammed and I mentioned the sexual violence. As I said in my opening remarks, the scale and intensity of it was shocking even to very experienced colleagues. You've been on the ground there with MSF. Talk about the work you've done, the challenges you've faced, and what you think needs to be done going forward.
Thank you, Ian. Before I do that, I kind of want to create a setting for all of you. So I'm sure some of you have been to refugee camps. Certainly you've seen images online or on the television. I've worked in many places for Doctors Without Borders or Médecins Sans Frontières, or MSF, as I will probably refer to it as. But I have not seen a refugee camp that looks quite like Kutupalong. I arrived at a similar point in time when the influx was increasing, and spent the first few days out on this berm of land where thousands of people were trying to cross into Bangladesh. And from there, in the mud and the rice fields and carrying nothing with no shoes, these women, children, and some men and very few elderly go into this camp. And in my mind, refugee camps, generally kind of dusty and flat, and rows of plastic sheeting and tents. And the Rohingya refugee camp is very different. It's quite mountainous. There's no roads. There's small little pathways. And as Ian mentioned, it's currently now almost 1 million people packed into about 3.5 square miles of land, which is about the size of Jackson Hole, Wyoming. So that's a lot of people in a very small amount of space with not enough water, not enough latrines, which contribute, especially when the monsoons come, to more and more health concerns. So one of the ways that the camp was described to me is that people were fleeing this very hellish experience in Myanmar to arrive in hell again. And I worked with a group of midwives to set up services for the survivors of sexual assault, most of them having had that experience in Myanmar before fleeing, which was really quite a challenge to find these survivors, to encourage them to come forward, to provide medical care, especially when they've already been on the road for a couple of weeks. So the risk of HIV has already set in, the risk of unwanted pregnancy has already set in, which was also quite different than some of my other experiences setting up services for survivors of sexual violence. That this, in many ways, was really an emergency. This wasn't, we can spend time in a community educating and talking about these things and encouraging women and girls to come forward, but how do we meet this population of people in the moment, on the border, to provide life-saving services while they can still be life-saving, which is quite challenging. To speak to what you mentioned about dignity, I think, and also what you mentioned a little bit about justice, Ian, I think one of the things that I've really learned in my work, but also was very potent and clear in the Rohingya population, is the importance of being heard. And without having opportunities to be witnessed, to have your story heard, healing is challenging. So you have women coming into the clinic to find out if they're pregnant, to find out what their options are if they are pregnant as a product of rape. They have very little shelter, they have very little food, they perhaps have already lost their husband in the fighting or the burning of villages prior to fleeing. They may be disconnected from their children. And so they have all of these other worries, and in many ways, the fact that they've been raped is one of the least of them. And yet, there's this desire to have their experience witnessed. And that was something that I was told again and again, how important it was for someone to look this woman in the eye and say, this experience wasn't your fault. This experience, it should not happen to anyone. And yes, you are right. The world needs to take notice of what's happening to your community of people, to your friends, to your family, to your culture. And I'm sorry that we're not talking more about that. So in order, I guess my big message to all of you is to encourage you to help the healing and restoring the dignity of the Rohingya by paying attention to what's actually happening.
Thanks so much. Nirmala, education has traditionally been one of the most neglected aspects of humanitarian response. For many years, it really wasn't so much talked about, now much more. Talk to us about some of the work you're doing at the Asian University of Women.
Thank you, Ian. Before I begin, I just want to thank Jane and her colleagues for giving me the opportunity to be present here at the forum and to say something about the university and the role of education in providing a future for young women from the Rohingyas. I think my colleagues, Ian and my colleagues, have very succinctly described the destitute and the misery that the Rohingya community is facing. I myself have visited Kutupalong recently and came back pretty devastated. It was my first experience of a refugee camp. And all I can say is there's an overwhelming sense of feeling that Bangladesh as a country has been left alone to deal with the crisis. And there are huge social, political, economic, and financial consequences for the country. And the refugees have settled in the most poorest part of the country, where it's also ecologically very fragile. And so given the backdrop of where the refugee settlements have taken place, Ian, I'm going to focus very much on the education and the role and how AUW actually sees the future for Rohingya women. AUW was set up in 2008 with the, I wouldn't say there's a strong mission statement, but there's a statement of purpose. And the purpose is to find talented and promising young women from very disadvantaged, very marginalized communities and give them the best quality education. And it started with a one-year access program. It was predicated on the fact that the secondary schooling had failed in South Asia, and it needed a bridging program to bring the students up to speed to graduate into undergraduate liberal arts program, very much styled in the US-style liberal arts. However, in 2016, for the first time, we reached out to particular groups like the garment factories in Bangladesh, which has about 4 million women employed, and we thought there should certainly be around 200 to 300 talented women who we can bring onto the program. Alongside them, most importantly, we reached out for the first time to the Rohingya women in registered camps around Teknaf and Ukia, where we found a number of young women who actually took the test, and we found them eligible to come and do our Access program. And I'm very pleased to say that we've had 4 cohorts of, this is the 5th cohort running, and we have around 90 Rohingya women with us, of which around 36 are already in the first year of undergraduate program. Time will, of course, tell how many of them will successfully complete their undergraduate programs. We give them all the support. We give them extra support to get them through the system. Now, the problem with there are 2 issues with education. One is, of course, the role of education is very clear. We see it as an integral part of our response to the crisis, because educational institutions provide the protective, stable, and secure environment when everything around them is descending into chaos. Secondly, we take a holistic view of education. We see it as an investment into their future. So creating a cadre of teachers, lawyers, doctors, architects, researchers is our purpose, so that when they go back, when the peace is finally established, they'll contribute to rebuilding and revitalizing their communities. And even when they're in the host country, which is giving them the space, they contribute to the peaceful living in the community. The third most important role we see is from AUW point of view. We would like to bring as many of the young Rohingya women into the national education sector. And I say this because Bangladesh has done a very good job in terms of providing them with roof over their heads, giving them the space. However, in the camps, there are about 1,100 learning centers, which are run by the international NGOs, UNHCR, Save the Children, UNICEF, World Food Aid Program, and a number of national NGOs who are operating the learning centers. And these cater to around children between the ages of 3 and 24. Now, 50% of our refugee population comprises that particular age, children and youth between 3 and 24. And the learning centers provide for ages between 4 and 14. They don't go beyond 5th grade. And there are about 20% of the refugee youth who are above the ages of 15 to 24, who have absolutely no access to any kind of education. There are adolescent clubs, but practically they offer nothing. Even the learning centers do not provide for formal learning. They give a bit of English, they teach a bit of maths, and very importantly, they teach a bit of Myanmar, because Bangladesh government obviously would not want them to learn Bengali for political reasons, and eventually they would like to see these young women and refugees go back to Myanmar. So the learning centers are very informal. The other problem we have is, we see is they have absolutely no qualified teachers. It's very difficult to find qualified teachers from the host community. They're managing somehow, it's struggling, but the conditions are not very conducive for qualified teachers to come and actually deliver teaching in these learning centers. So there are a vast number of learning centers which are really not active, or you see children outside the learning center hanging about, playing, but with no real educational teaching going on there. So there are also maktabs, which are the schools of religious instructions. They provide for Arabic language, and they provide for Quranic tradition. And against the backdrop of what's happening to the Rohingyas, by the parents, they are seen as places of safety and security where their children can spend some time. So overall, there is some kind of provision, but the access is very limited. I can go on about the difficulties of this, but I'll wait for you all to ask any questions. There are problems of access, not enough learning centers. We need to scale them up. There's a problem of quality in terms of there are no formal learning frameworks, there are no qualified teacher training programs, and there are no competencies in the learning frameworks to measure what the children are actually achieving. And the different international NGOs and the local NGOs are working now together, I must say. It's very heartening to see them work together to come up with a joint sector agreement, which is going to provide for greater access, more quality, and also draw upon the host community expertise to see how they can actually bring them in to provide for more opportunities, more formal learning within the camps. The issue of capacity building is a different one. Even if they were trying to get qualified teachers, the humanitarian agencies and the international NGOs are themselves struggling with not having visas on time. They do not have international work permits. Everything is delayed, and it's a spiral. Sorry, and like I said, I can go on, but I'm very happy to take questions.
So one of the phrases that most irritates me in this space in which many of us operate is when they talk about us being the voice of the voiceless. And I hate that phrase because I always say, no, we're not the voice of the voiceless. The people with whom we work have voices, but nobody wants to listen to them. And part of our job is to help make sure that they're heard. I'd love to hear more from you all about that. How are the Rohingya people being heard, both in the camps in Bangladesh and in Myanmar itself, but obviously particularly in the camps? How are they being heard about their current situation, about their hopes and aspirations for the future, including when and under what conditions that they might one day be able to go home?
No, thank you very much. Actually, we found out there is no formal mechanism or even informal mechanism to learn what Rohingyas really do want to say. And also, within the Rohingya refugee people, you already begin to see some layers of structures of power already in places. So if you really want to hear, you have to really go with total tools and techniques of anthropological approach. I just can share some of our experiences. Jointly with the Harvard University here, we so far undertook 3 studies. One was quantitative, but 2 are more qualitative, where we had to really put people on the ground. And many of those who are really collecting data and trying to learn, and here by data I am meaning more qualitative data, to learn what really they want to say about their future, what really they want to talk about their needs. So 2 studies we have undertaken, and we interestingly saw the study we undertook in February was different than the study we just concluded in April. And one of the key differences is that the willingness to return itself is changing among the mass population. So when you go down below something they call Maji, which is kind of their formal leadership now, often appointed by the military, who are kind of managing the logistical part of the distribution overall. So they selected the Maji, and they're the powerful now. If you can go below that and stay with those people for a long time, then you will begin to hear what they really want. So we found out in February, just to quote, about 4% of the Rohingya women and girls, they were saying, yes, we want to go back to home if A, B, C, and D are met, which included, for example, that we want our citizenship, we want the guarantee that we will have the safe and secured places, we will have the guarantee that we can go to our home, and we don't want a life in the camp. When we went back in April, we found a much larger group of people are kind of already beginning to feel that this cannot be the life itself, but they're putting more specific things. Now they're saying, we want UN security force to come they're learning this possibly by hearing many of the things, in Rakhine State to make sure that we will be protected. That means they still don't feel that they will be safe and secure when they go back. Just an example. And more larger number of women and girls, they feel like, that's our home. We have our land that we left. We have our property, we have our everything there. We want to go back, but we want citizenship, we want card, we want our ethnic identity restored, we want our to be guarded by UN Security Council so that we are not killed. Just an example. But there are many other areas you can hear what they want to say. So you have to really be there to extract that. But also you have to feed that to amplify their voices in multiple forums. Like next week I'm in New York. This will be my third trip after this happened in the UN building, talking to various groups that this is what they're saying. So how are you taking that into consideration in the conversation will be happening? Especially after this recent UN Security Council team went, I think the situation is becoming better, where we can really bring those voices in a way so that those are part of the discussion, as opposed to we divert that discussion totally.
This is something I actually think quite a bit about, especially because the work that I do is very specific to sexual assault, which is not something that is necessarily openly spoken about in any community. Certainly talked about in small groups. And I think that it's interesting in different populations, the stigma that rape carries. In the Rohingya community, it was quite easy to talk about rape by the military, I think because it was so widespread. But I also have thought a lot about the Me Too movement here in the US and how powerful that has been for survivors. I think how powerful that can be in terms of waking us all up to what happens in a day-to-day experience of living. And those are privileges that certain populations, including the Rohingya population, don't have. And in many ways also, there's also, because there's not this capacity to really be heard, because there aren't always people who are listening, or in the case of the Rohingya who are stateless and have no citizenship, right? They have no way of speaking on their own behalf. They can't take themselves to the international court. The UN has to do that for them because of their status. So I think a lot about what that means for us and what our responsibilities are, and the privilege that we have to speak on our own behalves, to join a Me Too movement, but also to grieve. So you can imagine these women have had their villages burned, their children have been thrown in the fire, their children have been slaughtered. More than 1,000 children were killed in the first month following the violence. More than 11,000 people were killed in the first 31 days from the 25th of August to the 24th of September. And you arrive in this camp with no food, no shelter, no water, no access to healthcare. You're unvaccinated. There's a measles outbreak. There's a diphtheria outbreak. The monsoon season is coming. And when do you sit down and say, I just lost my family. I just had this horrific, violent experience happen to my body. When do you get to grieve? And so when I think about being heard and needing a voice, I also think a lot about grief and how that process is also a privilege.
Mohammed mentioned earlier that there are over 40,000 pregnant women in the camps, and many of them presumably are pregnant because they were raped in those days in late August, early September, which means in the next few weeks, we'll see a lot of babies born of rape. How is that going to affect both individuals, but also kind of the dynamics and relationships in the camp?
I think it's a little complicated. The rates of requests for termination of pregnancy following the influx was quite high. Termination of pregnancy in Bangladesh is not legal, so that complicates the availability of health care for this group of women and girls. We're so many months in that women are in their second or third trimester of pregnancy. So if they are requesting for termination, we're looking at later term complications. So country, it's already illegal. And what we're seeing in the hospital is because medicine is readily available and traditional practices are always available regardless of where you are. There are a lot of women coming in with bleeding and complications and sepsis and perhaps even dying from trying to terminate a pregnancy on their own. We're also starting to see babies be abandoned. And that's a lot of that is because of the trauma, the continuing trauma, and lack of services for other support mechanisms for this particular group.
Nirmala, I want to come back to you on the role of education. You laid out some of the work and the challenges, but say a word specifically on how you see education as helping to give voice to the women who are coming under your programs.
I've got a real dilemma, Ian, and that is we've got about 80 to 90 Rohingya women. And it's, on the one hand, we are very pleased that we are able to give them access to higher education, which they would not have got otherwise. But these are women from the registered camps. But the real problem is those hundreds of young women who are within the camps that are not registered, they are not documented, and we can't really have access to them. And that is my real concern. Of course, the 80 to 90 Rohingya women we have today are being prepared. For example, we've got them jobs with Translators Without Borders. For the first time this summer, they're going to go back to the camps and work with their Rohingya fellow women. And they'll do the translation, they'll get a bit of money, and we are trying to get them into jobs of different kinds. But as I said, my real problem is how do we negotiate with the government, how do we negotiate with the government of Bangladesh to actually expand the humanitarian space? How do we achieve greater policy clarity in line with the conventions on the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which actually gives responsibility to the state to provide for education of the children within its jurisdiction. That's a real problem. And we are trying to work with the Education Ministry to see how we might actually access those women who really need it. This is your point about giving voice to those who actually are in need of it. We simply cannot enter these camps, the unregistered camps. We simply cannot have access to them. And the question for me is a very clear one. How do we do something that the government is not able to do? Or what are the kind of risks we are able to take, or we should be taking, which the government cannot take? And what are the kind of longer-term interventions that we can make, which are more sustainable? So the answer is not very clear, and we are in that space, in that dilemma.
We have about 10 minutes left. I'd really love to give people in the audience a chance to ask questions of any of our panelists. I was given instructions about where to tell people where the microphones are, which I have forgotten, but I think there is a circulating microphone. So if you have a question for any of the panelists, or just more broadly for the panel, there's a couple of people over here. Perhaps we can take a couple of questions here from, I can't see you in the lights.
Hi, my name is Christina Ment. I work with Let's Do It World, and I lived and worked in Myanmar a few years ago in Shan State. One thing that shocked me the most, that was kind of the beginning of the Rohingya, the ongoing issue again, was that other minorities, other national minorities, Shan is a few million people minority, right, are not having good time, right? They don't have access to their education in their mother tongue and so on. But what surprised me the most was that none of the people I spoke to from other national minorities had any sympathy or any feeling for Rohingya. It's like, yeah, but they're not supposed to get it. They're not our people. And I was just thinking that, can you ever, as a group of people, been in a harder situation where nobody from outside wants you, and also the ones who you imagine would be sympathizing with you also don't care about that? And talking about the voice, I had a colleague of mine from Shan state coming to Estonia and talking about Myanmar. Honest, kind, empathetic, fantastic person building an education system for Shan people, completely refused to talk about the Rohingya issue, or in that case, be the voice of the people and answer the questions or explain the horrific things that there are. So I've never in my life seen anything like that before or heard like that before, and I would like to ask you who work in that area, whether it's my personal experience or you see the same with other minorities who are refusing to recognize the sufferings of their fellow countrymen. Thank you.
Thank you. There's someone else at the same table who had a hand up. Maybe let's take it.
Hello, Josie from Help Refugees. It's kind of a question for all of you. You know, it's obviously, it's such a complicated issue, but there's so many people in this room who I imagine now feel a kind of push to do something to help. How can we lobby the UN to be making these voices heard? Where should we be funding? How can we be getting into these unregistered camps? What are the organizations is it local organizations? You know, how can we help, basically?
Great, two wonderful questions. Do you want to start?
I think the response to the first question is quite simply, I do understand what you're saying, and I've heard myself people actually expressing probably not as much sympathy for the Rohingyas. And I appreciate both sides of the view. I'm not taking any sides here, but I do understand, because I think it's undoubtedly the case that there is a very strong sense of feeling among the host communities, and especially around the refugee areas, and the population at large, that the international community has done little to actually to resolve this problem, or at least even trying to resolve it. And the country does feel, at the end of the day, that they are hard done by, and they are providing everything they can. Look at all the neighboring countries. Nobody's doing anything. India's got 40,000 Rohingyas. They see them as threat, and every day they're trying to send them back. China has its own interest in Myanmar. They want to distance themselves. Pakistan already has around 400,000. They're not willing to take any more. And it's left to Bangladesh to cater for the 600,000 that are already there, and many more with recent arrivals. And remember, Bangladesh is a country that's now gradually graduated into the middle income status. But it is a country that in itself is going through hardships with infrastructure problems. And all the Rohingyas have settled into, as I said, the very poorest areas. And very fragile parts of the country. And it's finding it very difficult. So you can understand why the host community in particular feels very threatened by the Rohingya settlement. And the challenge really for everyone is, how do you actually strengthen that capacity? How do you actually, while providing for the needs of the Rohingyas, how do you address the host community needs as well? And that's the balance to be struck. And somehow the country needs that support. Bangladesh has to have the international community's backing to assure itself that one day that peace will be restored, Myanmar will take back the Rohingyas and give them the well-deserved citizenship rights. And sorry, the second question
One very quickly.
Uh,
Very quickly, because we're running out of time.
Yeah, I think I'll pass on to you.
Okay.
You can deal with this.
I think in terms of what you can do, having these meetings with UN representatives, one of the things that was actually requested was that there be a bigger push from the citizens of the U.S. That the more we can say this is an issue that we care about, then the more power those representatives in the UN have to push for awareness and to push for changes. So I think encouraging your local congressmen and senators to fight for those for the Rohingya is important. There are some changes that have been happening in government. There's a group called the Never Again Coalition that is paying special attention to the Rohingya crisis. It's a little hard for me to speak about that as an MSFer, so I encourage you to go to them. But it's also complicated to know who to give to. The Bangladesh government is limiting the NGOs that are able to be present in the camp. So those that are already present are probably good places to reach out to and good places to start, like your organization and yours. Yeah.
No, thank you. Two aspects. One is working on the ground. We need to work both with the Rohingya as well as with the host communities. As mentioned, that host communities there have also been poor, historically poor. From BRAC, we had 7 offices for last 35 years there, running development program for the host communities. Yet people of that area were kind of in difficult situation. Now on the top of that, there were 500,000, now we have another 900,000 came in altogether. So it became an overwhelming situation. So we had to increase host communities program, but in addition to kind of program for the refugees. To make sure that therefore we run program for both refugees and host communities, at a minimum to ensure that the conflict, tension on common property resources, including market price increasing, all those do not go up. So that's one thing I would recommend. Second part is advocacy. Advocacy where we really bring the changing perspective, changing expectations as happening to different forum where discussion happen about Rohingya without knowing what do they want, how their perspective changing about life, what are the kind of dream desire they have for them and for their children. And we can together do it. Even we can together do it because this advocacy is not one organization job. All of us sitting here as civil society, I believe, or supporters of civil society organizations, we have role to play in informing decisions of policymakers or negotiators, resource allocators, to make sure there's a short-term support, medium-term support, long-term support. And that's definitely we can and we continue to need to do. And together we possibly can really push these things. One of the friends mentioned this whole issue of systemic marginalization, discrimination. I think that many of us, if we look into our mission statement and vision statement as civil society organization, we'll see that we want to see a world free from discrimination and marginalization, that we said. We want to see a world with social justice. If we are really believer of that, can we not really stand beside those people and be their representative? Is it just only handing over the handouts like water, sanitation, healthcare, food, and shelter? Or is it really also standing beside those people and say, yes, we want a world different, and therefore as civil society, we want to reaffirm their dignity, when we do want to really bring their voices and share it to different critically, strategically identified forums and places where decisions are made. Some of those will be difficult decisions, some of those will be immediate need decisions. Hope together we can make a difference gradually. Not only in that place, but all 65 million people in the world who are displaced, 25 million of them are refugees. We need to have a different world. Thank you.
Just two very quick last words to wrap up in response to the great questions. On the first question about attitudes towards the Rohingya, your very good question and your point reminded me of something I should have said at the beginning, which is that the very word Rohingya really can't be uttered in Myanmar. We had terrible fights with the UN system in just trying to convince UN officials to utter the word Rohingya, because as you know, the Rohingya are referred to in Myanmar as Bengalis. And it was incredibly difficult to do so. If you cannot say the word, if you cannot utter the name, it's an incredibly difficult place to start when you're thinking about restoring hope and dignity. So using the word and insisting that the word be used and insisting that the identity and integrity of the Rohingya people be recognized, I think is a hugely important step forward. And the last thing I just want to say is a word about justice. Too often, justice is seen as an abstract legal concept. It's something that happens in dusty courts of law with lawyers wearing wigs and gowns. And in the case of the Rohingya, as in so many other parts of the world, justice is not an abstract concept. It is essential for individual healing, and it is essential ultimately for the future of the Rohingya and for their ability to go home, restore their livelihoods, and restore their dignity. Thank you to the panelists. You were wonderful. Thank you for giving us the chance to be here. Thank you, everybody.